I had just been discharged after 9 days in the hospital when my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't your home anymore." I stood there on the front porch, still wearing the same soft gray sweater the nurse had helped me into that morning, my hospital bracelet not yet cut from my wrist, my overnight bag hanging from my shoulder like I hadn't quite arrived anywhere yet. The late afternoon sun was warm against my face, the kind of early fall light that usually made everything feel safe and familiar, but nothing about that moment felt familiar at all. The front door was closed behind Jessica, not slammed, not dramatic, just firmly shut like a quiet decision that had already been made without me. I remember noticing small things first, the way the welcome mat had been replaced with one I didn't recognize, the potted plant I had kept by the door missing entirely, the curtains inside drawn halfway like someone had adjusted the house to a new rhythm while I was gone. I shifted my weight slightly, my legs still weak from days in a hospital bed, and waited for Michael to say something, anything, because surely this was a misunderstanding. Surely my son would step forward and correct her, but he didn't. He stood a few feet behind her, one hand in his pocket, the other resting against the doorframe, avoiding my eyes like a man who had already chosen a side and didn't want to admit it out loud. "Michael," I said, softly at first, not accusing, not even questioning, just saying his name the way I used to when he was a boy and had scraped his knee or needed help with his homework, but he didn't respond right away. Jessica crossed her arms, her expression calm in a way that felt rehearsed, not angry, not emotional, just certain. "We talked about this," she said, not to me, but to him, like I was already outside the conversation. I looked down at my bag, at the zipper slightly open where a corner of my folded nightgown peeked out, and for a moment I felt something strange. Not quite sadness, not quite anger, just a hollow pause. Like my mind needed an extra second to catch up with what was happening. This was the same house I had walked into for over 30 years, the same porch where I had once held Michael's hand as he learned to tie his shoes, the same doorway where my husband used to stand every evening waiting for me to come home from work. And now I was standing outside it like a visitor who had arrived at the wrong address. "I just got home," I said quietly, not raising my voice, not stepping forward, because something in me understood that stepping forward wouldn't change anything. Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line, and she glanced briefly at Michael before answering. "Exactly," she said. The word hung there, simple and final. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest, heavier than anything I had carried out of that hospital. Behind them, I could see into the hallway just enough to notice that the small wooden table I had kept by the entrance was gone, replaced by something modern and unfamiliar, like the house had already been rewritten without me. Michael finally looked at me then, but only for a second, just long enough for me to see the hesitation in his eyes before it disappeared. "Mom," he started, his voice low, careful, like he was trying to keep everything controlled. "It's just, things are different now." Different. I repeated that word silently, turning it over in my mind as I stood there on my own porch, realizing that whatever had changed hadn't started today. It had just finally reached a point where it could no longer be hidden. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, straightened my posture despite the ache in my back, and took a slow breath. I didn't argue. I didn't ask another question. I just stood there, looking at the door that used to open for me without hesitation, and understood, in a way that was both quiet and absolute, that this moment wasn't the beginning of something breaking. It was the end of something that had already been taken apart piece by piece while I was too busy trusting the people inside to notice. I did not knock again after that. I simply turned around, stepped off the porch carefully, and walked down the 3 familiar wooden steps that suddenly felt unfamiliar under my feet, as if they belonged to someone else's house now. My car was still parked at the curb where the hospital shuttle had dropped me off 15 minutes earlier, the engine cold, the front seat holding the folded discharge papers I had not yet read. I placed my bag gently on the passenger seat, taking a moment before closing the door, as though I needed to acknowledge that this was real, that I was not going back inside, that no one was going to call my name and say it had all been a misunderstanding. The street was quiet, just the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block and the faint rustle of leaves moving in the breeze. I had lived on that street for more than 3 decades, knew the rhythm of every neighbor's routine, the sound of children walking home from school, the way the light shifted across the houses in the late afternoon, and yet standing there beside my own car, I felt like a stranger who had taken a wrong turn. I sat down slowly in the driver's seat, my hands resting on the steering wheel without starting the engine, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, almost polite in its execution, and that made it harder to grasp. I replayed the last few minutes in my mind, Jessica's calm voice, Michael's hesitation, the closed door, each detail settling into place like pieces of a puzzle I had not known I was solving. There had been signs before, small ones that I had dismissed as stress or adjustment or the natural changes that come with time. The shorter phone calls, the missed visits, the way Jessica would answer questions directed at Michael as if she needed to translate him, the way my opinions had slowly stopped being asked for, then slowly stopped being acknowledged. I had told myself it was normal, that families evolve, that I needed to give them space, but sitting there in the quiet of my car, I realized that what I had called space had been distance, and what I had called patience had been permission. I reached over and picked up the discharge papers, flipping through the pages without really reading them, just needing something to hold on to, something that felt structured and certain in contrast to everything else. Instructions, follow-up appointments, medication schedules. Clear, precise, predictable. It was almost comforting. My phone buzzed in my purse, a soft vibration that broke through the stillness, and for a brief second, I thought it might be Michael, that perhaps he had come to his senses, that he would ask me to come back, but when I pulled it out, it was a message from the hospital reminding me to schedule my follow-up visit within 7 days. I stared at the screen for a moment, then placed the phone back in my bag without responding. 7 days. I repeated that quietly to myself, not because of the appointment, but because it was the first concrete measure of time I had heard all day. 7 days to check on my health. 7 days to recover. 7 days to decide what came next. I looked back at the house one last time through the windshield, the curtains still drawn, the door still closed, no movement, no hesitation from inside, and I felt something shift within me, subtle but undeniable. The shock was still there. The confusion had not fully settled, but beneath it, something steadier was beginning to form, not anger, not yet, but awareness. I started the engine, the familiar sound grounding me in a way nothing else had, and placed my hands firmly on the wheel. For the first time that day, I did not wait for anyone else to tell me what to do. I simply pulled away from the curb and drove forward, not knowing exactly where I was going, but knowing with absolute certainty that I was no longer going to sit still and pretend that nothing had changed. I drove without a destination for the first few minutes, just following the familiar streets out of habit, turning where I had always turned, stopping at lights I had waited at for years, as if routine alone might steady something inside me that still felt unbalanced. The late afternoon traffic was light, a few cars passing by, people heading home, people returning to places where they were expected, where the door would open when they arrived, and I noticed that detail in a way I never had before. Expected. It was such a simple thing, and yet it had been taken from me without warning. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel, even as my thoughts began to move more clearly, less like fragments and more like a quiet, deliberate reconstruction of everything that had led to that moment. It had not happened overnight. I could see that now. It had been gradual, almost careful, as though each small change had been placed just far enough apart that I would not question it. I thought about the last year, the way Jessica had started handling the household bills, offering to simplify things after my husband passed, the way Michael had agreed so quickly, relieved even, as if responsibility had been something he was eager to hand over. I remembered the conversations that had followed, how I had been included at first, then informed, and eventually not mentioned at all. Small decisions became larger ones. A change in the bank account access. A new insurance policy I had not reviewed. The quiet replacement of my name with theirs on documents I had trusted them to manage correctly. I had not been pushed out in a single moment. I had been eased out, step by step, until standing on that porch was no longer a shock to them, only to me. I slowed the car as I approached a familiar intersection, the one that led toward the grocery store I had visited every week for decades, and I realized I was not hungry, not in the way that food could solve. What I felt was a different kind of emptiness, one that came from understanding something too late, from recognizing a pattern only after it had already been completed. I turned right instead of going straight, choosing a quieter road lined with tall trees whose leaves were just beginning to change color, shades of gold and red catching the fading sunlight, and for a moment, I focused on that, on something outside of myself. Something that moved forward without asking permission. My breathing slowed. My thoughts sharpened. There was something else beneath the realization, something that had been there even before I reached the house, something my husband had tried to tell me in his own way during his final years. He had always been careful with details, especially when it came to finances, often insisting on handling things personally, not out of control, but out of caution. I used to tease him about it, telling him he worried too much, that family was not something you needed to protect yourself from, and he would smile in that quiet way of his, never arguing, just saying, "It is always better to understand what is yours." At the time, I thought he meant responsibility. Now, sitting behind the wheel as the road stretched ahead of me, I began to wonder if he had meant something else entirely. Something he had seen before I did. Something he had prepared for in a way I had never taken seriously. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel slightly, not out of fear, but out of focus, as the first clear thought formed in my mind since leaving that porch. I did not know exactly what had been done, or how far it had gone, but I knew one thing with certainty. I had trusted them with everything without ever verifying what remained in my name, what was still mine to claim, what had been quietly moved beyond my reach. That uncertainty settled into something more solid, not panic, not regret, but a quiet decision. I needed to know. Not later. Not after things became more complicated. Now. I glanced at the dashboard clock, calculating the time, the day, the next step forming without hesitation. The bank would still be open for another hour. I adjusted my direction without thinking twice, turning onto a main road that led straight toward the financial district, the familiar glass buildings rising in the distance, reflecting the last light of the day. For the first time since I had been told to leave, I was not reacting to what had happened. I was moving toward something. Toward answers. Toward clarity. Toward the simple, undeniable truth of what still belonged to me and what did not. And as the car moved steadily forward, I realized that whatever I found, whatever had been done behind my back, it would not remain hidden any longer, because I was no longer willing to look away from the details that mattered most. I pulled into the bank parking lot with 10 minutes to spare before closing, the building exactly as I remembered it, tall glass windows. Reflecting the fading sky, the automatic doors sliding open with the same quiet efficiency they always had, as if nothing in the world had changed except me. I sat in the car for a brief moment before stepping out, gathering my bag and the discharge papers, smoothing them unnecessarily as though appearance still mattered in a situation where I no longer felt entirely visible. Inside, the air was cool and still, the kind of controlled environment that made everything feel orderly, predictable, and for the first time that day, I felt something close to steadiness. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that comes from routine rather than recognition, and I returned it with a small nod, not expecting to be remembered, not needing to be. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her tone professional, neutral. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "I need to review all accounts under my name," I said, my voice calm, measured, more certain than I felt just an hour earlier. She nodded and directed me to a desk where a bank manager, a woman in her late 40s with careful eyes and a composed manner, introduced herself as Mrs. Reynolds. There was a brief exchange of formalities, identification, verification, the small steps that create a structure around information, and then she turned her screen slightly toward herself and began typing. The quiet clicking of her keyboard filled the space between us, each sound precise, deliberate as though something important was about to be uncovered. I watched her expression carefully, not expecting anything unusual at first, but then I noticed a subtle shift, a pause that lasted just a fraction longer than it should have. Her eyebrows tightening ever so slightly before she quickly smoothed her expression back into professionalism. "Mrs. Harper," she said gently, "when was the last time you personally reviewed your accounts?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that settled into my chest immediately. "It has been a while," I admitted, choosing honesty over assumption. She nodded again, her fingers moving more slowly now as she pulled up additional records, her eyes scanning the screen with a focus that made the silence feel heavier. "There are several accounts listed here," she continued, her tone careful, some of which appear to have limited recent activity and others that have undergone changes in access permissions. I felt my hands rest more firmly on the edge of the desk, not gripping, not reacting outwardly, but anchoring myself as the words began to take shape into something more concrete. "Changes?" I repeated quietly. She turned the screen slightly toward me this time, pointing to a series of entries, dates, authorization notes, names that were familiar in a way that now felt different. Michael's name. Jessica's name. Added. Adjusted. Modified. Each entry precise, each decision recorded, each change documented in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. I followed the lines with my eyes, not rushing, not interrupting, allowing myself to see everything exactly as it was. "These changes were authorized over the past 12 months, Mrs. Reynolds explained, her voice steady, and it appears that access to certain accounts was expanded, while others were restructured." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting the information settle, letting each detail connect to the quiet suspicions that had begun forming on the drive over. This was not confusion. This was not an accident. This was a pattern, deliberate and consistent, carried out over time with precision. "Is there anything," I asked slowly, choosing each word with care, "that remains solely under my control?" The question hung in the air between us, simple but essential. Mrs. Reynolds studied the screen for a moment longer, then navigated to another section, her expression shifting again, this time not with concern, but with something closer to surprise. "Yes," she said after a pause, turning the monitor fully toward me now. "There is." I leaned forward slightly, my focus sharpening, the quiet inside me giving way to something more defined, more purposeful. The numbers on the screen were clear, unmistakable, and attached to an account I did not immediately recognize, one that had not been mentioned, not discussed, not included in any conversation I had been part of over the past year. My name stood there alone beside it, without additions, without modifications, without any secondary access listed. Untouched. For a moment, the room felt very still, as if everything had narrowed down to that single detail, that single piece of information that did not fit the pattern of everything else. I did not react outwardly. I did not ask another question right away. I simply looked at it, taking in the numbers, the structure, the quiet certainty of what it represented. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in confusion this time, but in understanding. Whatever had been done, whatever had been taken, whatever had been rearranged without my knowledge, it was not complete. There was something they had not reached, something they had not known about, something that was still, undeniably, mine. I did not ask how much was in the account right away. Instead, I kept my eyes on the screen for a few seconds longer, reading the numbers slowly, carefully, as if rushing would somehow make them disappear. They did not. They remained exactly where they were, clear and steady, a quiet contradiction to everything I had just learned about the other accounts. "This account," I said finally, my voice even, "how long has it been active?" Mrs. Reynolds glanced back at her screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard again, pulling up the history with practiced precision. "It was established several years ago," she replied, her tone measured, "and it appears to have remained unchanged in terms of access permissions since it was opened." Several years. I let that settle in my mind, aligning it with a timeline I had not yet fully pieced together. That would have been around the time my husband had begun insisting on handling certain matters privately, the same time he had become more deliberate about paperwork, more attentive to details I had once considered routine. I remembered the conversations now with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, the way he would pause before answering certain questions, the way he would say, "Not everything needs to be shared with everyone," and I had brushed it off as caution. As habit, never as intention. Was this account ever accessed by anyone else? I asked, my gaze still steady, my posture unchanged. Mrs. Reynolds shook her head. No additional authorized users are listed. All activity has been consistent and controlled. Controlled. The word stood out, not because of how it was said, but because of what it implied. This was not something forgotten. This was something protected. I reached into my bag and pulled out my identification again, placing it on the desk without hesitation. "I would like full access to this account," I said, not asking, not suggesting, simply stating what needed to happen next. She nodded immediately, sliding a form toward me, the paper smooth beneath my fingers as I read through it carefully, not skipping a single line this time, not trusting familiarity to fill in the gaps. Every detail mattered now. Every word had weight. I signed where required, my handwriting steady despite the quiet shift taking place inside me, and handed the document back. As she processed the request, I allowed myself a brief glance around the bank, taking in the stillness, the order, the predictability of a place where everything was recorded, where nothing simply disappeared without a trace. It was a stark contrast to the house I had just left, where changes had been made quietly, gradually, without explanation. When Mrs. Reynolds returned her attention to me, there was a subtle difference in her expression, not concern this time, but a kind of respectful awareness. "You now have full control over this account," she said. I nodded once, absorbing the statement not as reassurance, but as confirmation. Control. It was a word I had not associated with myself in quite some time, not since I had begun trusting others to manage what I once handled directly. I gathered my papers, placing them back into my bag with care, not rushing, not lingering. "Is there anything else you would like to review today?" she asked. I paused for a moment, considering the question, then shook my head slightly. "No," I said, my voice calm. "This is enough for now. Enough to understand that what had been taken was not everything. Enough to realize that the story I had been told without words, the one where I no longer belonged, was incomplete." As I stood up from the chair, I felt the same physical fatigue from the hospital still present, the slight weakness in my legs, the lingering heaviness in my chest, but beneath it, something else had settled into place, something steadier, more deliberate. I was no longer trying to make sense of what had happened. I was beginning to understand what had been overlooked. And as I walked toward the exit, the automatic doors opening once again without hesitation, I realized that the next step was no longer about asking questions. It was about deciding what to do with the answers I now had. I did not drive far after leaving the bank. Instead, I pulled into a quiet parking lot across the street, turned off the engine, and sat there with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle around me again. The sky had begun to dim, the soft gold of late afternoon fading into a cooler shade of blue, and for a moment, I simply watched the light change on the windshield, steady and predictable in a way nothing else had been that day. The envelope in my bag felt heavier now, not because of the papers inside, but because of what they represented. Clarity. Proof. Something solid in a situation that had felt carefully blurred for far too long. I reached into my bag and pulled the documents out again, placing them on my lap, smoothing them one more time as if that small action could help me organize my thoughts. There was no urgency in my movements anymore. No confusion. Just a quiet, deliberate process of understanding. They had made changes. That much was clear. They had shifted access, adjusted permissions, moved things slowly, quietly, over time. But they had not finished what they started. They had not found everything. And more importantly, they had assumed I would never look closely enough to notice. That realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of calm that surprised even me. A calm that felt less like emotion and more like awareness. I thought about Michael again, about the way he had stood behind Jessica, about the brief moment when he had almost met my eyes and then looked away. That hesitation had not been confusion. It had been acknowledgement. He knew something had changed. He just chose not to question it. I closed my eyes for a second, not to escape the moment, but to let it settle completely. When I opened them again, the decision I needed to make no longer felt complicated. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my finger pausing for a moment before selecting a name I had not called in quite some time. Thomas Green. My husband's attorney. The man who had handled every major decision, every contract, every piece of paperwork my husband had ever taken seriously. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, listening to the soft ringing as I waited. It did not take long for him to answer. "This is Thomas," he said, his voice steady, professional, familiar in a way that felt grounding. "Thomas, this is Evelyn Harper," I said, my tone even, controlled, without explanation at first. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a subtle shift in his voice as recognition settled in. "Mrs. Harper," he replied, "it has been a while." "It has," I said simply. "I need to review everything that was set up before my husband passed. All of it." There was no hesitation in his response. "Of course," he said. "When would you like to come in?" I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, then back at the papers in my lap, the numbers still clear in my mind, the pattern beginning to form more completely. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "As early as possible." "I will have everything ready," he replied. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock works, I confirmed. When the call ended, I placed the phone down beside me and took a slow breath, not out of stress, but out of certainty. This was no longer about what had happened at the house. It was no longer about being told to leave. That moment had already passed. This was about understanding the full structure of what had been built, what had been altered, and what still remained untouched. I gathered the papers carefully and returned them to my bag, closing the zipper with a quiet, final motion. Outside, the first streetlights had begun to turn on, one by one, steady and consistent, illuminating the road ahead in a way that felt almost symbolic. I started the engine again, my movements calm, controlled, without hesitation. For the first time since that afternoon, I was not reacting to something that had been done to me. I was preparing for what I would do next. I arrived at Thomas Green's office the next morning 10 minutes early, not out of habit, but because I did not want to feel unprepared again. The building stood quiet in the cool morning light, a modest brick structure with large windows that reflected the street outside, unchanged from the last time I had been there with my husband years ago. I paused for a moment before stepping inside, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder, not out of nervousness, but out of intention. Every movement now felt deliberate. Inside, the reception area was calm, the soft hum of a copier in the background, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. A receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and directed me toward Thomas's office without hesitation, as if my name had already been expected. When I stepped inside, he was already standing, a folder open on his desk, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that told me he had prepared for this conversation with care. "Mrs. Harper," he said, extending his hand, his tone respectful but measured. I nodded slightly as I took the seat across from him, placing my bag beside the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice," I said. "Of course," he replied, sitting down and turning the folder toward himself. "I have reviewed the documents your husband put in place before his passing, as well as the most recent updates on record." There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, but intentional, as if he was choosing how to present what came next. "There are a few things you should be aware of," he continued, his voice steady, his words precise. I did not interrupt. I simply listened. "Your husband established a layered structure for your assets," he explained, sliding a set of documents across the desk toward me. "Some accounts were placed under joint access for convenience. Others were designated with conditional permissions, and a portion was secured under a private trust that remains exclusively under your control." I glanced down at the papers, recognizing certain terms, certain signatures, certain dates that now aligned with the timeline I had begun to piece together the day before. "The changes made over the past year," he continued, "appear to have affected only the accounts with shared or adjustable access. The trust, however, has not been altered." I looked up at him then, meeting his eyes directly. Meaning? I asked quietly. He held my gaze without hesitation. Meaning that the most substantial portion of your assets, including the ownership structure of your primary residence, remains legally protected and cannot be modified without your explicit authorization. The room felt very still in that moment, not tense, not overwhelming, just clear. The house. I did not react outwardly, but the words settled into place with a precision that made everything else begin to align. So the house, I said slowly, is not fully under their control. Thomas shook his head once firmly. No, it is not. Based on the documents your husband established, the property is held within the trust. You are the sole controlling party. I let that information settle without rushing to respond, allowing it to take its full shape before moving forward. And if someone were to attempt to sell it? I asked. Any transaction would require your direct approval, he replied. Without it, the sale cannot proceed legally. I leaned back slightly in the chair, not out of relief, but out of understanding. This was not about recovering something that had been lost. This was about recognizing what had never been given away in the first place. They have been acting as if the house belongs to them, I said, my tone even, not emotional, just factual. Thomas nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. That assumption is not supported by the legal structure in place. I glanced down at the documents once more, tracing the lines of text with my eyes, each clause, each condition, each carefully written detail now carrying a weight I had never fully appreciated before. My husband had not been overly cautious. He had been precise. What are my options? I asked finally. Thomas folded his hands on the desk, his posture steady. You have full authority to reassert control over all protected assets, he said. That includes restricting access, reversing unauthorized changes where possible, and initiating legal measures if necessary. I nodded once, absorbing each word without hesitation. There was no confusion left now. No uncertainty. Only a series of clear, deliberate steps waiting to be taken. I closed the folder gently, placing my hand on top of it for a brief moment, not out of sentiment, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what it represented. Control had never been lost. It had only been assumed otherwise. And now, for the first time since standing on that porch, I understood exactly where I stood. I did not leave Thomas's office immediately after our conversation ended. Instead, I sat there for a moment longer, the folder still closed beneath my hand, letting every detail settle into place with a clarity I had not felt in a long time. There was no rush now, no urgency driven by confusion or fear, only a quiet sequence of decisions forming one after another, each one grounded in something real, something documented, something that could not be dismissed or rewritten behind my back. When I finally stood up, I did so slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that the next steps mattered more than the reaction itself. Thomas walked me to the door, his expression unchanged, professional, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in the way he nodded, as if he recognized that this was no longer a situation I needed guidance to understand. Outside, the morning air felt different from the day before, not lighter, not warmer, just clearer, as though everything had shifted into focus. I walked to my car without hesitation, placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat, and sat down behind the wheel, my movements steady, controlled, familiar again in a way they had not been the day before. I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out my phone, scrolling through the screen with deliberate precision, not searching, but selecting. I found Michael's name and paused for a brief second, not out of doubt, but to ensure that what I was about to do came from clarity, not impulse. Then I pressed call. The line rang twice before he answered. Mom? His voice carried a trace of surprise, not concern, just uncertainty, as if he had not expected to hear from me so soon. I need you and Jessica to be at the house this afternoon, I said, my tone even, calm, without explanation. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that comes when someone is trying to understand what has changed without being told directly. Why? He asked, the word simple, but carrying more weight than it should have. I did not answer the question. 3 o'clock, I said instead, my voice steady, leaving no room for negotiation. Another pause followed, slightly longer this time, and I could almost hear the shift in his breathing, the moment where hesitation met realization. "All right," he said finally, his tone more careful now. "We will be there." I ended the call without adding anything further, placing the phone back into my bag with the same deliberate motion I had used for everything else that morning. There was no need to explain. Not yet. Explanation would come later, in the right place, at the right time, when words could no longer be ignored or dismissed. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, the road ahead familiar, leading back toward the same house I had been told to leave less than 24 hours earlier. The difference now was not in the distance or the direction. It was in the understanding of what that house represented, not just as a place, but as something defined by structure, by law, by decisions that had been made long before anyone thought they could quietly change them. As I drove, I did not replay the conversation from the day before. I did not dwell on Jessica's words or Michael's silence. Those moments had already served their purpose. They had revealed what needed to be seen. What mattered now was what came next. I reached the street just as the clock on the dashboard turned to 12:30. The neighborhood is quiet. As it had been the day before, the houses unchanged, the sidewalks empty, everything appearing exactly the same on the surface. I slowed the car as I approached my driveway, my eyes steady on the house, the curtains still drawn, the door still closed, no visible sign of movement from inside. I did not stop. I continued past it, driving a little further down the street before turning into a nearby parking spot where I could see the house clearly without being seen immediately. I turned off the engine and sat there, the folder still resting on the seat beside me, the weight of it no longer heavy, but precise. This was not about returning home. It was about reclaiming what had never been given away. And this time, I was not standing at the door waiting to be let in. I was deciding exactly when and how it would be opened. I remained in the car until a few minutes before 3, watching the house with the same steady focus I had learned to rely on since leaving the hospital, noting the smallest details without attaching emotion to them. The way the front curtain shifted slightly as if someone had passed behind it, the faint reflection of movement near the hallway mirror, the subtle confirmation that they were inside, waiting, perhaps uncertain, perhaps confident, but no longer in control of what would happen. Next, when the clock on the dashboard changed to 2:57, I reached for the folder beside me, holding it for a brief moment before opening the car door and stepping out, the air cooler now, the light softer. Everything quieter in a way that made each step toward the house feel more deliberate. I walked up the driveway without hesitation, my pace even, my posture straight, not as someone returning to ask for permission, but as someone arriving with clarity. The front door was already unlocked when I reached it, and for a second, I noticed that detail without reacting, the quiet acknowledgement that they were expecting me, that something had shifted in their understanding as well. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house still present beneath the subtle changes, the rearranged furniture, the absence of certain objects that had once defined the space, the small but unmistakable signs that someone had begun rewriting the environment to fit a different narrative. Michael stood in the living room near the window, his arms loosely at his sides, his expression guarded, while Jessica sat on the edge of the couch, her posture composed but tense in a way that had not been there the day before. Neither of them spoke immediately. They were waiting. I closed the door behind me with a quiet, controlled motion and walked further into the room, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, not confrontational, just clear. "You said 3 o'clock, Michael said first, his voice measured, as if testing the tone of the conversation before committing to it. "I did," I replied simply. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that carries more meaning than words when everyone involved understands that something has already changed. Jessica leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on me with a kind of careful attention that felt different from before, less dismissive, more calculating. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with something quieter beneath it. I did not answer right away. Instead, I placed the folder on the small table between us, opening it slowly, allowing the movement itself to hold their attention. Papers shifted softly as I turned them toward them, not sliding them across the table, not pushing them forward, simply making them visible. Michael stepped closer first, his eyes moving over the documents, scanning the lines, the signatures, the structure that he had never taken the time to question before. Jessica followed, her posture tightening slightly as she read, her expression changing in small, controlled ways that revealed more than any words could have. I watched them both without interruption, giving them the time to see what I had already understood, the space to recognize the difference between assumption and fact. "What is this?" Michael asked quietly, though the question did not carry confusion so much as realization. "It is the structure your father put in place," I said, my tone steady, not raised, not sharpened, just clear. "The one that determines what belongs to whom." Jessica's eyes moved more quickly now, returning to certain sections, certain phrases, certain lines that left no room for interpretation. "This does not make sense," she said, though the words felt more like resistance than uncertainty. I met her gaze directly for the first time since entering the room. "It does," I replied calmly. "It just was never explained to you." The silence that followed was different from the ones before, heavier, more defined, no longer uncertain but shifting, adjusting, recalculating. Michael straightened slightly, his attention moving between the papers and me, the hesitation from the day before replaced by something more grounded, something that suggested he was beginning to understand the position he had placed himself in. "So, what are you saying?" he asked. I closed the folder gently, my hand resting on it for a brief moment before I answered. "I am saying that nothing here was ever yours to control," I said, my voice even, without accusation, without emphasis, just stating what had already been written long before any of us stood in that room. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled exactly where they were meant to, clear and final, leaving no space for misunderstanding, only for response. Michael did not respond immediately after I spoke. He stood there with the folder still in his hands, his eyes moving across the pages again, slower this time, as if reading them differently now that he understood what they meant. Jessica, however, did not look down again. She kept her eyes on me, her posture straightening slightly, her expression shifting into something more controlled, more deliberate, as though she was already searching for a way to reframe what had just been made clear. "There has to be some mistake," she said finally, her voice calm but firmer than before. "We have been managing everything for over a year." I nodded once, not dismissing her words, but not accepting them either. "You have been managing what you had access to," I replied evenly. "That is not the same thing as ownership." The distinction settled between us without resistance, precise and unambiguous. Michael exhaled quietly, lowering the folder onto the table, his shoulders shifting slightly as if the weight of what he had assumed was beginning to settle into something heavier. "Why did Dad do this?" he asked, not looking at me directly this time, his voice lower, less defensive, more uncertain. I held his question for a moment before answering, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted him to understand it in the same way I had come to understand it. Because he believed that responsibility and entitlement are not the same thing, I said calmly. And because he knew that time changes people in ways they do not always notice themselves. Jessica let out a small, controlled breath, her fingers resting against the edge of the couch, tapping once, then stilling. "So what now?" she asked, her tone measured, though the question carried more urgency than she intended to show. I stepped closer to the table, placing my hand lightly on the folder, not to reclaim it, but to anchor the moment. "Now," I said, "everything returns to its proper structure." I opened the folder again, turning to a specific page, sliding it slightly forward so they could both see it clearly. Effective immediately, all access permissions that were adjusted without full review will be reevaluated, I continued, my voice steady, each word placed carefully. That includes financial accounts, property management, and any authority that was assumed rather than granted. Michael's eyes lifted toward me then, the hesitation from before replaced by something more direct, something closer to recognition. "You are taking everything back," he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what he now understood. I met his gaze without hesitation. I am restoring what was never meant to be transferred, I replied. Jessica shifted slightly on the couch, her composure holding, but only just. You cannot just decide that overnight, she said, her voice controlled, but edged with resistance. I did not raise my voice. I did not move closer. It was never your decision to begin with, I said quietly. The room fell into a stillness that felt complete, not empty, not uncertain, but settled. In a way that left no room for negotiation. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, the faint sound of its engine barely noticeable through the walls, a reminder that the world beyond this room continued unchanged. Inside, however, everything had shifted. Michael ran a hand through his hair, his movements slower now, more thoughtful, as if he was trying to align what he had believed with what was now in front of him. What do you want us to do? He asked after a moment, his tone no longer defensive, no longer distant, just direct. I closed the folder once more, my hand resting on it briefly before I answered. I want you to understand that this house, these accounts, everything connected to them, operates under a structure that was put in place long before any of this, I said. And from this point forward, that structure will be followed exactly. I let the words settle, not adding anything unnecessary, not reinforcing them with emotion. They did not need emphasis. They were already complete. Jessica looked away first, her gaze shifting toward the window, her posture tightening slightly as if recalculating something she could no longer control. Michael remained where he was, his attention still on me, but quieter now, more grounded. I took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, the same way everything else in that room had been adjusted, carefully, deliberately, without force. You asked me to leave yesterday, I said finally, my tone unchanged, not bitter, not sharp, just clear. Today, I am choosing how this house is managed moving forward. And with that, I turned slightly, not to walk away, not yet, but to signal that the direction of this conversation had already been set, and it was no longer mine alone to explain. No one spoke for several seconds after my last words settled into the room. The silence was not empty anymore. It was structured, like everything else had become, defined by what had already been said and what could no longer be undone. Michael shifted his weight slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before lifting again, as if he was searching for something to say that would still hold its meaning. Jessica remained by the window, her posture composed but distant now, no longer trying to lead the conversation, only reacting to it. I did not fill the silence. I allowed it to remain exactly as it was, because for the first time, it was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. I turned my attention briefly to the room around me, noticing the small changes more clearly now, the rearranged furniture, the missing photographs, the absence of objects that had once marked time and memory within these walls. It no longer felt like something that had been taken from me. It felt like something that had been temporarily misplaced, something that could be restored without force, simply by returning it to its original structure. I will be staying here, I said after a moment, my voice steady, not raised, not tentative, just clear. Michael looked at me immediately, his expression tightening slightly, not in resistance, but in adjustment. Here, he asked, as if the word itself needed to be redefined. I nodded once. This is my residence, I replied. That has not changed. Jessica turned slightly from the window, her arms crossing loosely, her composure returning in a quieter form. We live here too, she said, her tone controlled, but no longer certain. I met her gaze without hesitation. And that arrangement can continue, I said calmly, as long as it respects the structure that is in place. The distinction was subtle, but it held. It did not remove them. It did not force anything immediately. It simply set the terms clearly, without negotiation, without emotion. Michael exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension in his posture easing into something more thoughtful. What does that mean exactly? He asked. I stepped closer to the table again, resting my hand lightly on the closed folder, not opening it this time, not needing to repeat what had already been shown. It means that decisions regarding this house, finances, and any associated matters will be made with full transparency and proper authorization, I said. Nothing will be assumed. Nothing will be adjusted without my direct involvement. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. They drew a clear line, not as a threat, but as a boundary that had always existed, now simply acknowledged. Jessica's eyes shifted briefly toward Michael, then back to me, her expression quieter now, less calculated, more contained. "And if we do not agree?" she asked, though the question carried less weight than before. I did not hesitate. "Then we follow the structure that is already in place," I said. Agreement is not required for something that has already been defined. The room settled again, but differently this time, not with tension, but with acceptance, even if it was not fully spoken. Michael nodded slowly, not in submission, but in recognition, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a quieter understanding of where things now stood. I stepped back once more, creating space again, not to distance myself, but to allow the moment to hold its own shape without pressure. "I will have the remaining documents reviewed and updated where necessary," I added, my tone even. "You will both be informed of any changes moving forward." There was no need to say more. The structure had been restored. The boundaries had been set. And for the first time since I had stood outside that door the day before, I was no longer reacting to what had been taken from me. I was standing within what had always been mine, without needing to raise my voice, without needing to ask for anything to be returned. Everything that mattered had never left. It had only been waiting for me to see it clearly again. The house felt different after that conversation, not because anything had visibly changed, but because everything had been redefined in a way that no longer relied on assumption or silence. I remained where I was for a few moments after speaking, allowing the stillness to settle naturally, not forcing movement, not signaling an end, simply letting the reality of the situation exist without interruption. Michael eventually stepped back, his posture no longer guarded, but quieter, as though he was adjusting to a structure he had not fully understood until now. Jessica did not say anything further. She moved slightly toward the hallway, her expression composed but distant, her earlier certainty replaced by a kind of restraint that had not been there before. I watched them both without judgment, without urgency, understanding that what had shifted could not be undone with a single conversation, but also knowing that it did not need to be repeated. The foundation had already been restored. I turned away from the table and walked slowly toward the hallway, my steps measured, not hesitant, simply deliberate. The house responded to me in small, familiar ways, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint echo of movement in spaces I had known for decades, the quiet presence of a place that had never truly changed, only been rearranged. When I reached my bedroom door, I paused briefly before opening it, noticing that some things had been moved, others replaced, but the structure remained the same, the walls unchanged, the windows still letting in the same afternoon light. I stepped inside without hesitation, setting my bag down on the chair near the window, the same chair where I used to sit in the evenings, reading, thinking, existing without needing to question my place. I did not begin to rearrange anything immediately. I did not rush to restore what had been altered. Instead, I stood there for a moment, taking in the room as it was, acknowledging both what remained and what had been changed, allowing the space to settle into its original meaning without forcing it. Control, I realized, was not about immediate action. It was about clarity, about understanding what belonged to you without needing to prove it repeatedly. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street, the same quiet neighborhood, the same passing cars, the same steady rhythm of a place that continued regardless of what happened inside any single home. There was a calm in that realization, not because everything was resolved, but because everything was now defined. Behind me, I could hear faint movement from the living room, soft footsteps, low voices, the beginning of conversations that would no longer exclude me, not because I demanded inclusion, but because the structure no longer allowed otherwise. I did not turn around. I did not listen closely. I did not need to. For the first time in a long while, I felt no need to monitor, to question, or to anticipate what others might do next. I reached up and gently removed the hospital bracelet from my wrist, setting it on the small table beside the bed, a quiet marker of everything that had brought me to this point, not as something to hold on to, but as something that no longer defined the present. Then I sat down in the chair by the window, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture relaxed, but grounded, not as someone reclaiming space through force, but as someone who had simply stepped back into what had always been theirs. The house did not need to be taken back. It only needed to be understood again. And now that it was, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, only a steady, quiet continuation of a life that no longer depended on permission, only on presence.